close to the end. And you know, I'll probably just say something like, hey, if we've got somebody with a question, you know, then we've got a couple people that can get you a mic, but you'll kind of see whether that happens or not, because we may run out of time, because this would be a tight 45 minutes. Be gone. Thanks. Good morning. Gentlemen, good morning to you. Good, good, good. I'm going to get a little water.
Thank you.
Thank you. I needed that.
Grab a cup for you. Yeah. Oh, Chip's already got a couple. Oh, it's fine.
You're sitting here. Somebody would actually kick us off because it's 9:30, so I don't know how they're
in the center of the country because I'm
if they've got
located.
on and good morning. Good morning. Okay, there it is. The mic's live. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our panel discussion this morning. My name is Chip Lerwick. I'm a managing director with Aon, and my specialty is food and agribusiness, which is what gave me some credentials to come up and moderate this morning. Our panel discussion this morning is the global food system. Are insurers keeping up with risk? I'm just going to warn you right now, we're not going to answer that question directly here today. This audience is full of insurance professionals, people that have some understanding that can impart from what we have with 4 panelists that make up different perspectives across the food production system. They're going to talk about changes in the food production system that are opening up opportunities, gaps, and challenges for how insurers need to rise to that challenge. So you'll be the best judge of kind of what you're hearing today is where are we delivering or not delivering in terms of insurance value. I also will help address some of that as we're kind of on the discussion today. So before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and set a little background for everybody just to kind of set a paradigm here as we're thinking about this challenge. We are facing some unprecedented challenges coming into the year 2050, predominantly driven by population growth. It's estimated that the world's population in 2050 will be over 9 billion people. And with 9 billion people on the planet, we will have to grow twice as much food as we currently are growing today to feed that population. That twice as much is not just due to the increase in population, but it's due to the rising economic standards of the developing world, the insatiable demand for protein, and the inputs required to feed that protein. So a lot of changes. That's a lot of food to grow in light of some very big challenges. Today, most of the planet's arable land is currently in production. While there may be some additional land that can be put into production, not enough to feed that many people growing twice as much food. Water, essential to growing crops. 70% of all the fresh water on the planet today is used for agriculture. We don't have enough available water to grow twice as much food. Things are going to have to change, and if it weren't enough that we've got those big macro issues to deal with, we have climate change, which is creating some weather variability, increased frequency and severity of storms, challenges on where crops traditionally are grown geographically. Those things are all shifting and changing. We have soil erosion that's happening at an alarming rate. We have a finite amount of topsoil, and we're eroding that away. We have environmental degradation that comes from inputs that are washing off of crops or animal agriculture that's causing some challenges. So big challenges on that front. And then if we flip over to the consumer's driving a lot of change in food production and demands. That consumerism has actually forced most of us to kind of come along for the ride to expect that 365 days a year you walk into the grocery store, you get strawberries. So that puts a real pressure on the global food system and supply chain in terms of where food is produced and how it's transported. We have consumerism that's coming in now that's shaping the types of foods that we're seeing on grocery store shelves and getting promoted to, whether that's gluten-free, organic, vegan, or another aspect might be just looking at health trends related to ancient grains. Whatever it might be, consumers are driving enormous change in the food supply system. We have chronic disease. We have wellness issues that are sometimes brought on by nutrition and in many cases solved by nutrition. I think we're going to see a lot more in the coming years around how nutrition can help to lead to a more healthful planet for people. So a lot of change is going to come on that front. And then the last point I would make, because there's a lot you could talk about across this food ag continuum and from farm to fork, but it's farming. We're here in Iowa. World Food Prize down the road here. We were there last night, and there's an awful lot that's changed in just agriculture today. So if we look at what is happening with tractors that are out trying to get in the fields today to put their crops in, those tractors are just a breath away from not needing a driver at all. Most farmers are just riding along in the cab with auto steer telling the tractor exactly where to go and how much is going to be planted in every part of that field. So a lot of technology. We wouldn't have thought cybersecurity was a risk or an issue in ag 20 years ago. Today, it's very much front and center. So a lot of changes are happening in how food is being produced. So that's kind of a backdrop. What we have today is we've got 4 different panelists, 2 of which, Arjun and Natalie, are going to kind of represent more of the kind of startup community in some areas, in different aspects of where they are introducing technology into the food and agribusiness production string. We have Ken from Wells Fargo, who's going to give us a little background from the financial perspective in terms of lender, investor, and analyst into the food and agribusiness. And then Keith from the regulatory landscape with the Food Safety Inspection Services out of the USDA. So we'll have a nice backdrop of different speakers to talk about certain areas. And I will tell you, we will not cover the landscape of farm to fork in this 40 minutes that we have together. So would be happy to take any questions throughout the presentation. Certainly at the end, I might call for that. We've got a couple folks that'll get us some mics, but without further ado, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and would just ask them to ask or answer one question, and that is, from your perspective, what is the biggest change you're seeing in kind of food production in the food system that's driving risk, or just changes in general that you want the audience to be aware of? So Ken, why don't you start us off?
Sure, thanks, Chip. Good morning, everyone. Having spent the early part of my career as an insurance sector analyst at Geico and then on Wall Street, I feel like, hey, I'm back with my people. This is great, so thanks for having me. My name is Ken Zuckerberg, and at Wells Fargo, I'm a senior vice president. I focus on advising companies in the food manufacturing, packaged food, upstream farm input companies, and even farmers just on strategy and innovation and the changing landscape. I spent a good bit of my career as a professional investor. Been at Wells just over a year now, and again, really delighted to be here. Wow, risk, Chip, where do we start? Should I start with risk or what's changed?
I think what's changed, if you would, I think it's going to be illuminating just in terms of what's happening.
Ah, boy, what has changed? Okay, so after the financial crisis, I was a financial institution specialist going into the Great Recession. After that, I started looking at agriculture, and I thought what was fascinating was we had the UN's proclamation about the global growth. We had the Feed the World trade. We had commodity prices going up. Corn, peaked at about $8 in 2012 or 13. And I guess what I thought about was, wow, as someone newer to ag, what's going on here? Between 1970 and 2008, the average price of corn was $2.37 a bushel. And after 2008, it was quite a bit higher. So why? You had ethanol, you had China demand, and you had a lot of speculation. That wasn't sustainable. I thought there was a real scare coming, and as I was mentioning to my friend Natalie here, when I looked at Monsanto valuing the stock, it was, really priced very high relative to its underlying earnings. So I knew something was going to happen. I knew it wasn't going to be great, but I wasn't entirely sure the magnitude. Price bubble, commodity price bubble popped in 13-14. What other industry do you know of that has had net farmer income go in half and stay at that level for 5 years? So that's where we are today, the proverbial 7 lean years. I think we're, approaching that. What's changed, Chip? Everything. We are increasingly focused on the farmer, the American farmer. The median farmer is losing money, at least in crops. We have farm input companies consolidating. They're consolidating not because they love each other. They're consolidating because it's the only economic way to survive. We have tractor companies, John Deere, expanding to other areas of the world, Germany, other product lines. We have food companies that are every day reinventing themselves and paying up for innovative technology. Just for perspective, usually in private equity or venture, if you're buying an asset, the general metric is 6 to 7 times EBITDA, or just think about it as sort of pre-tax cash earnings. Between 2015 and 2018, based on the study we did, the average food and beverage transaction was sort of 16 times, so 2.5 times. So lots has changed. In terms of risk, lots of risks in the system, but I think within those risks, Chip, are opportunities for innovation, either financial innovation or insurance innovation. I'll just call out a few risks that I jotted down on the plane here. You obviously have lending. As a lender, Wells Fargo lends to agriculture producers. In 5-6 years of stress, obviously we're starting to focus and mitigate the risk of default on farm loans. Another risk is in this food system with respect to product recalls. I'm sure some of my colleagues here will talk about. And then, of course, we just have business model and reinvention risk, which arguably the digital transformation that's occurred in every industry is disrupting the way we all think about things. For example, who the heck thought a little bookseller that started in a small office in Seattle would one day, I don't know, control the world? No, that's too strong. They would sell many things. Who thought that same bookseller, Amazon, a marketplace, would get into the supermarket business? So I just think it's a fascinating time.
Great, thank you. Natalie?
Hi there, everybody. My name is Natalie DiNicola. I am with Benson Biosystems. I'm an environmental toxicologist by training. I joined ag because I really cared about the impact. There's a few industries that have so much impact on the environment as agriculture does. I started my career working at Monsanto. How many people have heard of Monsanto? How many people are familiar with the controversy about Monsanto? Yeah. Well, I was involved in starting and eventually leading sustainability there, which was really about companies thinking about the environmental and social impacts of their business, the transparency of how they do business, all of that, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more. And a big part of my job was as a primary spokesperson, particularly for consumer audiences that didn't know a lot about food production and agriculture, and oftentimes had a really real interest in how food was made, which was great to see that rising interest, but a lot of frustration and concern that what they wanted to see happening with food production wasn't being met. And I guess, representing Monsanto, I had the opportunity to really hear that directly from a lot of different kinds of organizations, hunger organizations, environmental organizations, moms, dads, just students, who really recognized how important food and agriculture was in everybody's life. I left the company a few years ago and I started doing consulting with organizations from growers, from farmers, to consumer packaged goods companies like, big food manufacturers, as well as a number of startups. And what really interested me about the startups was the investment in food and agriculture for many years was about $900 million a year in food and ag innovation. And in 2015, it spiked to $4.5 billion. And a lot of that, most of that, did not come from traditional agriculture players. It came from people outside. Amazon would be an example. Google Ventures is an example. A lot of investors on the coast who recognized that there was this unmet need of what consumers wanted, more diverse food system, different kinds of crops, different kinds of players. They didn't like a few companies doing it. They wanted to have more focus on health and nutrition, more focus on environmental sustainability. And these investors felt like, this is an unmet need. I can invest in trying to help fill that. And part of that investment was in agricultural technologies. And that's what our company is an example of. We are a 7-year-old company. Our biggest investor is Google Ventures. And what we've essentially done is taken advantage of a lot of the recent advances around artificial intelligence, machine learning, data analytics, that has affected so many parts of our lives. Agriculture is one of the last industries to actually experience that sort of revolution, and it's really happening right now. I think you referenced that, Ken. And so we basically have built a computational engine using machine learning and big data analytics with all the genetic diversity of different crop species so that we can make much better predictions of how you can breed or cross two plants so that you can get the kind of outcomes you want. We're also using a newer technology called gene editing. How many people here have heard of gene editing? Mostly in relation to medicine? Or have you guys heard about it in the relation to food? Most people hear about it in medicine because pretty remarkable things are happening with it in terms of medicine. But it also has huge application for food because it allows us to make very precise changes. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you want, Chip. But the point is, these different technologies converging enable us now to do different kinds of changes in crop production, drawing on the natural genetic diversity that already existed in plants that we weren't really leveraging as fully, so that we can develop more healthy and more sustainable crops much faster, and we can do it in a lot more crops. And our company has built this engine to make some products ourselves, but also we're a platform company. So we've opened it up to any organization anywhere across the value chain, from a traditional seed company all the way to a retailer, like a Walmart, Kroger kind of company. Any of them can really be drawing on this natural genetic diversity of plants to develop more of the kind of products that consumers want and farmers can benefit from too. And as far as risk goes, or the change in risk. So I kind of described some of the change there, because what this has opened up is, for many years, as Ken mentioned, there were really like 3 or 5 companies that could afford to do genomic improvement in crops. And it cost so much money and so much time and took so much expertise. They only focused on the largest acre crops, corn, soybeans, cotton primarily. But there are 30,000 edible plant species on the planet. Our current food system uses about 30, and most of this innovation has happened in 3. So what's happening with these new kinds of technologies and this sort of collaboration across the value chain is we are able to improve a lot of different crops, which means different opportunities for farmers and their profitability. And we're also able to, I would say, disrupt the value chain. So the value chain of food and agriculture goes from the grower through many, many, many different players till it gets to the consumer. Frankly, that's probably one of the reasons why there hasn't been as effective a connection between what consumers want and what farmers are doing. It's a very disparate kind of chain. And what some of these new innovations are enabling is we're disrupting that, where downstream players can more directly design what kinds of crops and ingredients they want and work much more directly with farmers. And as you can imagine, that creates great opportunity, and it also creates some different kind of risks. When a company like Walmart can actually design and grow and source their own kind of melon, that's a different set of risks and opportunities for a company like that.
Great, thank you. Keith?
Hi, I'm Keith Gilmore, and I'm a veterinarian by trade. I joined the Food Safety Inspection Service back in the mid-90s and have been with them since in a number of different roles. And currently I am a senior executive with the agency, and I help develop our goals, and create our policies that see us going into the future and make sure that our policies get implemented. As far as the agency itself, we oversee the production of red meat, poultry, egg products, and catfish. Our partner is the Food and Drug Administration, and they oversee vegetables, fruits, grains, and a number of different things. But we work hand in hand with them to make sure that our food supply is safe and wholesome. And we also work with the Centers of Disease Control, and we work closely with them to make sure that people that are getting sick because of foodborne illnesses, that we identify the source of that food and we can get it off the market. 30 years ago, we very rarely had recalls. And then in 1991 or 2, the Jack in the Box outbreak occurred with E. coli on the West Coast. And since then, because of that outbreak, which sickened thousands of people and killed quite a few too, the focus of the agency has been from going from a poke and sniff to decide whether or not a product is wholesome to a more scientific-based approach where we're actually testing for pathogens. And I can tell you every week we have at least 2 or 3 recalls. And our biggest recalls at current times are due to allergens is the biggest cause. Food allergens, peanuts, fish, shellfish, tree nuts, wheat, milk. Those are some of the bigger allergens. And so we need to make sure that people who are reading the label know what exactly is in that product so that if they do have an allergen to those specific things, that they can help to identify the products that they need to stay away from. We have been working with whole genome sequencing, which is a more modern way of fingerprinting specific pathogens. So if we have an outbreak and we can identify the pathogen that is involved in that outbreak, we have a database that we can go back and say, this whole genome sequence is similar to this one, and it's fairly specific as to letting us identify where that product is coming from, and so we can act more quickly to get it off the market. Risks that we have right now, it is becoming a more and more global market. And we have high concentrations of food in different areas, and so biosecurity, not biosecurity, but food security is an issue. If a group should want to quickly make a change in the food supply, or they want to poison the food supply, that's always an issue that we have to be concerned about, because that food supply is disseminated fairly wide and it can have a real impact. We also have a risk associated with animal disease. With people and animals and products moving globally really quickly now, there's also pathogens that move with them that affect our livestock markets. It was 2 or 3 years ago we had avian influenza go through the center of the country, and it affected Iowa specifically because we're the highest density of egg layers in the country, and so a number of the poultry facilities had to shut down and clean their systems before they could bring more birds on to lay our eggs. It was probably the first time that we've ever had to import eggs into this country. So that was a very big impact.
Great, thank you, Keith. Arjun?
I'm Arjun, Ganesan, engineer by education. I've been involved in startups for about 20 years now. Most of them have had some sort of an intersection with finance and hardcore engineering. Most recently, over the last 7 years, I've been involved in this company named Ancera. What we do is we've figured out ways to implement diagnostic sensors directly on the farm or on the processing plant. And as a consequence of being able to collect faster, better information, we're able to characterize risk much better, be able to make recommendations on what is working and what's not working. Given some of the complexity that we've spoken about, a lot of these large food systems, it's been fantastic to have veterinarians and plant managers and people that are in finance, the treasurers that are operating individually, but getting all of them to talk a unified language where you're actually saying, how should I be thinking about my risk? And that risk could very well be, so I've been very specifically working on the poultry industry over the last 4 years or so. So we work all the way from the genetic eggs to breeders, broilers, to processing plants and the distribution in retail. And we work with a variety of people. We work with the actual poultry integrators. We work with the suppliers, the large vaccine companies, the probiotic companies that try to sell products to them. And we also work with trying to characterize the risk a little bit better, so this information is disseminated back to the C-suite and saying, what is my veterinarian actually talking about? Three big areas that we are focusing on very specifically. We've spoken about pathogen detection and sequencing. A lot of it is being done, but being able to do it very quickly within a few hours, being able to get to a genomic sequence within the same day, as opposed to what's available in the market, which can take anywhere from several weeks to months. So speeding that up is a little bit of what we do. We apply that to make animal health better, so making sure that the chicken are much more predictable in size, making sure that they are growing in a very predictable way because of how we're counting through it. Second thing is, inside the processing plant, we look at bacteria, so salmonella, and saying, how does that proliferate, or when is it most vulnerable when you can actually attack it? And then the last piece of it is actually looking at the microbial organisms in your food and saying, how can I extend the shelf life of this product to last a lot longer, as opposed to the week after purchasing it where it expires? Can we actually figure out ways in which we can make it last longer? That's a lot of what our company does. I think the most, from where I stand, it's been very interesting to look at the availability of data, other forms of data. I'm talking about data from the weather, from location, data which was historically not available, but is now available, and it's led to a real increase in technological innovations and analytics that are coming out. But I think the most interesting part for us has been the availability of really quick data through novel sensors through the entire process. That change is tremendous, right? I mean, so Chip spoke about how there are tractors where the cab only has a driver just sitting in there because there's really no other job in there. But that has happened as a consequence of multiple sensors that are going on the tractors. I think that that's just the beginning. What we're starting to see in how that is translating out to the rest of the supply chain is absolutely tip of the iceberg. I think the second challenge over here is also we spoke about gene editing, and we're talking about microbes. We're looking at microbes in a completely new light in this day and age, right? I mean, we have historically for the last 40, 50 years thought about microbes as the enemies, but that perspective is changing, right? Most of us take some form of probiotic. Most of us eat yogurt. All of that involves being able to coexist with microbes. And I think understanding that, especially in the large scale, I think we're at the very beginning, and being able to underwrite the risk, if that means, what if the product can actually stay on the shelf longer? What if I can actually guarantee that that the amount of productivity, the yield coming from a seed is significantly higher just because of microbes? So I think it's very exciting times just in terms of change that are happening. But as always, there are the known knowns, which is the risk that we've all spoken about. But then anytime things are changing at a breakneck speed, there's also the unknown unknowns, right? So, and that's, it's definitely interesting times.
So with respect to all these new technologies, and Arjun, you just kind of gave us some, let me jump to you, Keith, and just ask you kind of within the regulatory body, what kind of new technologies are impacting the regulation and the agency policies? What things are you seeing in that?
What we have been focusing on as an agency over the past 10 years or so is modernizing inspection. We traditionally have had inspectors sitting on a line, poking and smelling product as it's coming down the line, and now we're moving away from that because poking and smelling is not going to be able to tell you whether there's E. coli or salmonella on the product. What we've been doing with modernization is we've been allowing the food production companies to do the sorting on their own as far as this is good, this is bad, this is something that the agency needs to look at to make that determination. And in return, the companies themselves have been testing product more frequently and testing for pathogens and other things that could pose a risk to the consuming public. And that is driving the industry to take more control of their own process and making sure that what they're doing is effective in eliminating risk involved with their products.
So I think in terms of the insurance industry, some of that's going to play a big part in kind of how do we look at and evaluate general liability coverages, product contamination, recall coverages as we start to look at modernization in these novel tools. On the data and novel tools that we've just heard a little bit about in the introductions, how are those being used in optimizing production? And Natalie, maybe I'll start with you a little bit from a Benson Hill perspective, thinking about how you're using data and novel tools there for production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mentioned precision breeding and gene editing. So gene editing is really, just so for folks to understand how it applies in agriculture, when we want to cross two plants, we're crossing essentially all the genetics of the plant to get whatever specific traits we want. It's a bit messy because you're crossing the entire, all the genetics. And so it takes a lot of time and a lot of cycles in the field, and it's part of why product development takes so long of new crops. One of the things that we're able to do with data analytics is make better predictions, really better understand. All the sequencing costs and things like that have come down. Cloud computing costs have come down. So now even smaller companies like ours can be building out these engines that can make better predictions of what you can cross. So you can do more of it essentially, through the computer, and you're doing less of it through actual field testing. So it cuts down the time of development from something like 10 to 12 years to maybe 8 years or something. What gene editing can do is with gene editing, we can very precisely understand what actual change we want to make in the crop. Usually, let's just take a tomato, for instance. So tomatoes, we all love the taste of an heirloom tomato, but there was a lot of breeding that went on to make tomatoes have a certain uniform kind of shape and color and ability to be transported and lots of things, and yield. Things that were really important in terms of improving the efficiency, and I would argue the sustainability of tomatoes, so that we're using every drop of water most effectively by getting high yield, so that we're not losing a lot in transport, so that they have a longer shelf life, things like that. But we bred away from flavor. Well, there are things we understand about, the pathways, the biochemical pathways that happen within a tomato that enable flavor. And we can look at, well, what did we actually change when we did all these years of breeding? And with gene editing, we can very precisely go in there and make the change so that this current, variety of tomato that looks so great and transports great also can taste really great. And we can do it because we can do it precisely. We're not having to take as many times of crossing the entire genome to get to that. And so that allows us to reduce the time of development still further. It's really accelerating the plant breeding process, and that allows us to get more into the actual food development cycle. So that's what's really one of the applications we see of really analytics and machine learning coupled with some of these sort of biological tools that are doing pretty cool things. I think that Arjun, he mentioned microbials. This is another super interesting place, whether it's microbials of our own gut, microbials of the plant's gut, microbials that are in the soil, and analytics is really helping us to understand all of that and those interactions much more effectively.
Arjun, maybe you could build on that just for a moment and just talk a little bit about some of the novel tools that are adding value in a way that you're seeing it being used. In addition to what you're seeing from a risk mitigation standpoint with the diagnostics, maybe tell us a little bit about how you're leveraging that.
Sure. I think a couple of things come to mind, one of which is there are now microbes that are being put into seeds, right? So that they're called endophytes. What they do is they're now taking microbes that live in the soil on the roots of plants from sub-Saharan Africa, where they have been forced to become drought resistant for several years, and really saying if we can take those and put them into our cotton seeds that are being grown here, would we be able to make them as drought resistant? Would we be able to make them as resilient to a whole variety of different situations and lead to higher yield? that is very real, right? And those are products that are now starting to roll out, which is allowing the grower to actually lock in profits way before they are actually beginning. So it's contrary to how people have traditionally been thinking about it. But then again, thinking about the more esoteric world of the rest of food beyond crops, what actually goes on a chicken egg, or for that matter, a chicken, for example, again, I'll take everything back to chicken and turkey just because I understand that space a little bit better. As with everything else, when they have parasites, they don't grow very well, which means that the weight of your chicken can fluctuate plus or minus by 15-20%. So as the grower, there's really a lot of uncertainty about what am I going to end up with, because the underlying commodity of corn and soy meal are hedged. But if you think about the razor thin margins, it is not, chicken as a commodity is not indexed to either of these places. So being able to say, can we actually use biotechnology to create value, but to carry over the value that's being created to the grower? So similar to crops where we're saying, hey, this cotton is going to have 15% more yield, but can I actually say your chicken is not going to lose weight because we're managing the parasites a little bit better? Just for context, in the United States, we consume about 8.5 billion chicken a year, right? So just think about what those numbers really are. I think it's fascinating what that can really scale up to.
Chip, I'd like to offer a perspective, but first an audience poll. So how many people here are involved in actuarial science or pricing life insurance products? Okay, just one. What did the rest of everyone else do? I'm not sure. Okay, so if you're pricing a life policy, I'm not an expert, but you need data, right? You need data on lifestyle and health and smoking and whether you do or don't. So just imagine that you were a big life insurance company, but instead of people, it was plants. And just imagine that there was that all the data that you needed to predict plant health and growth, you didn't use. And then imagine that your client, the plant, lives outside with weather volatility that constantly changes. And then just imagine an industry that has, I don't know, 200 billion of production, if not more, in crops. And just imagine you were winging it. That's how I looked at this industry 10 years ago. And ironically, there's so much science involved in each part of agriculture, but it's not coordinated. So I said to myself, the aha moment was, got it. So this is taking sort of the tools, coordinating it in a way that other industries have done. So if people didn't think the life insurance industry was an innovative industry, okay, let's forget that. You are. Think about ag and food saying, wow, we have all this data. We have these tools that actually, and as Arjun can explain better than I, actually process, rotate, and then predict. And then you can do that to improve the health of the farmer, better product, healthier food, more efficient supply chain. Chip, that's kind of how I look at this journey. Right. And sorry if I went a little bit down a rabbit hole, but I felt like I needed to frame it. I can't believe there's only one actuary.
Yeah, well, the other room's got analytics going on, so that's where they all are.
So we lost all the actuaries there. Thank you for coming.
I'm just going to build in a little kind of insurance perspective on what we just kind of heard, because we're hearing a lot about science and technology, novel things that are being done that are introducing things that were not traditional from a food production standpoint. So in terms of an insurance industry, what are we doing to think about the intangible assets that are being incorporated into all of these ideas? The intellectual property, are we insuring that asset? Because the valuation of many of these companies is predominantly based on intangible assets for which is uninsured. So real risk is there that the insurance industry needs to think about how to address. General liability, product liability, errors and omissions. When we're thinking about gene editing and new technologies, we heard about biologicals, which is a very hot trend right now, and what we're putting on seed treatments that's going into the soil. Does that introduce an environmental hazard for which we've got adequate insurance coverage? Things are changing so rapidly that there is not a point somewhere across every line of coverage that we don't have to reconsider how do we adapt the coverages and the way that we're approaching our insurance philosophy to match with what's actually being done in the food production today. So there's a lot of change and a lot more to come because these companies are very new. Arjun?
One small direct area that I can think about over here, Chip, is that historically, if you look at industries like pet food industry, which have had a lot of outbreaks that have happened. So we spoke a little bit about product recall insurance, a little bit where the USDA, FSIS really comes into play. But we're also looking at this huge chunk of the market. It's the large companies that have the captives to do a lot of this self-insurance, to do product liability, or product recall, business interruption type insurances. But then true to what Aon does in being able to not just offer better underwriting models through better information, but also offering crisis response tools, being able to figure out what is the values, right? We've spoken, all of us have spoken about wholesale products, but by the time it actually propagates out to retail, how does that value and how does that liability transfer at every stage? Because we've seen some of this happen with telematics and everything else. People have tried to put smaller and smaller buckets of more personalized insurance. But typically when we take it for granted and say, hey, my lettuce is going to be good for 15 days, not all lettuce is made the same. Maybe some of this lettuce needs to be in a deli. Maybe some of this needs to be in retail. Maybe some of this needs to be at Olive Garden. Does that mean that you can underwrite each of these things better? So I think it's a world of opportunity that's there.
Complexity. It's unbelievable complexity. So we knew this would happen. We have 3 hours worth of content to squeeze into 45 minutes. We're delighted to be around afterwards if anyone has any questions. Thank you all for coming. I hope you got a little perspective of kind of some pretty significant changes that are occurring and the fact that we probably aren't really ready to address it all yet from an insurance perspective, but we certainly look for more innovative ideas. So thank you again for coming. Appreciate the time.